wind, water, fire, and earth. Elements of creation, elements of destruction. These are the forces of nature's fury. In Queensland, Australia in 2011, a deluge hit so violently, towns, houses, people's lives and livelihoods were swept away.
It was a monster.
Yep, oh my goodness.
It was horrifying.
Towns became islands.
3/4 of the state was declared a disaster zone.
20,000 homes flooded, thousands evacuated, lives lost.
I ended up going to 14 funerals in 9 days.
A mutant storm that took a country by surprise and gave us a taste of the realities of what our weather could be like in the future. January 2011, Toowoomba, Queensland. A town on a mountain range 2,000 feet above sea level. Rain had been falling here for months. Office worker and father of 4, David Jutson, was back at work from a family summer vacation. A creek, often dry, ran along the back of his workplace.
I'd just returned to work from Christmas holidays and I came back. It had been raining for weeks, heavy rain. We'd often watch during the rain and you'd see the creek rise and then fall.
But David wasn't concerned.
Initially, I pulled my phone out because I thought my kids would love to see what was happening at Dad's work.
That's coming fast.
Only a few miles from Toowoomba, in the small farming community of Grandam, Marty Warburton thought this was going to be just another wet summer day. Marty lives in town with his wife and 11-year-old son, and he runs the local service station down the mountain from Toowoomba.
Yeah, it was expected every couple of years you'd go through some minor, normal flooding event. Sometimes it wouldn't come into the shop. It'd only just run through the main street. Other times it'd come through and just a couple of inches or knee-deep at the most. So as much as it was a bit of a pain in the backside to prepare for it, it was generally viewed as a beneficial thing for the community.
Matthew Brandon worked for a local helicopter rescue service on Queensland's Central Coast.
I was in the Australian Army for 15 years. I was a medic for about 8 of those years and then an air crewman on Black Hawk helicopters for the remainder.
In January 2013, when a freak flood swamped the countryside, his vast experience would prove a godsend. These 3 people would be at the front line of 2 of the most destructive disasters in Queensland's history. Grace Legg from the Bureau of Meteorology understands Australia's unique weather patterns, from the extreme dry heat of the deserts to the tropical cyclones of the north.
Australia, because it's such a large country, has quite a variety in weather. We get those cold fronts coming through the southern parts, which bring a lot of rainfall and thunderstorms with them. In between, we have desert area. Doesn't see as much rainfall, but in the northern parts, we have the monsoon and wet season, which sees large amounts of rainfall in those tropical areas. They've got those mountain ranges as well, so it allows that water to move very quickly through. We've seen occasions where we've turned towns into lakes.
Ella Harrison is a flood engineer with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority. Ella and her team's job is to know all there is about monster floods, the damage they cause and why they happen. And when it comes to hard rain hitting these lands, the culprit is a weather system called La Niña.
The weather patterns at that time, it changed from what's called an El Niño to a La Niña. So we'd switched from a period of drought almost to this period of intense rainfall.
La Nina is the opposite of El Nino. So instead, we start to see those warmer sea surface temperatures around us. We start to see an increase in our trade flows. So you get a lot more uplift in the atmosphere, which allows more shower and thunderstorms to form through the area. So you generally have a much more wetter period.
The month leading up to this disaster was the wettest December in Queensland's history. A raging cyclone called Tasha was just off the coast, and an east coast low, an intense low-pressure weather system, was developing over the eastern seaboard.
There was an east coast low that was moving around the Queensland, so it went off and headed towards New Zealand and picked up more fury and then came back inland and crossed over these areas, dumping masses of water across a catchment that was already wet. So basically that means the ground's already saturated. Any more rain just has to flow over and find its way to a river, which is what happened in those Toowoomba and Grandam and those upper catchments as it came into the Brisbane River.
One of the first communities to be hit by the flood was Toowoomba, a mountain city in Queensland. But on January the 10th, 2011, the local residents had no idea a dangerous weather pattern was forming.
You don't tend to prepare for flood in Toowoomba. It doesn't flood here. Toowoomba is at the top of a mountain range, and I guess in our heads, you think that flooding is going to occur in valleys and plains.
And the rain was starting to make its way down the mountain into the farming plains of Grandam, a small town 20 miles away.
We were used to normal floods in town, and this was anything but a normal flood.
Marty's lived in this area for the better part of his life.
Yeah, it was expected at least every couple of years you'd go through some minor, normal flooding event.
In Grantham, floods mean water, and water means life.
We are essentially a farming community, so without water, there's nothing here. You sort of look forward to it.
And Marty thought this wasn't going to be any different.
On the Sunday, because it was a normal flood, we'd get our phones out and take footage of the water in the street and people driving up and down through the water. And a standing sort of joke was about the weather forecast that you get. And it was always possible rain with the chances of some local flooding. So I had the wireless going at the service station on batteries, listening to the local weather forecast on the Sunday, which I was already standing in knee-deep water at the time, mind you. And the weather forecast came on and said, oh, possible chance of showers and rain with isolated local flooding events. And I thought, oh, I'll take this off. So I got my camera and recorded myself saying, well, the weather forecast today in Grantham is fine with a possible chance of rain and some local flooding. And then I turned the camera around and showed the water knee-deep through my shop. Just an update on the weather. Officially, layman's terms, if it doesn't rain, it'll be fine. And possible chances of flooding in the local region. Glad that they've put that over the wireless because guess what? I think they might be close, eh? They must have been looking out the window before they did that forecast. This is the main street of Grantham.
But Marty's mood changed quickly.
At first, it was going through my head was, you know, is it going to be worse than normal or higher than a normal flood? And then once the water rose so quickly, it was, should I be here anymore?
For survival expert Kai Furneaux, floods are far more dangerous than people realise.
The misconception about floods is people think that they're a gradual thing, so they're going to have some kind of warning. But a lot of flooding can happen instantly and be disastrous. The most important thing with floods is that you head for higher ground. Avoid walking or driving through any floodwaters. You can get knocked off your feet in just 6 inches of water and your car can get flooded away in less than a foot.
Back in Toowoomba, David Jutsam couldn't take his eyes off the rising creek at the back of his workplace.
the water in this little creek behind us started rising, and we were just watching out the window for a while, and it got to a level just below the trees. I'd never, ever seen it come up that high before. And that day, it rose, and it just kept rising.
Don't, oh mate, don't, just let it go.
He's taking the air out of his tyres. As soon as you do that, it floats down.
I just grabbed my phone and started recording. And in the space of, 5-10 minutes, the water rose to something that it just kept on rising, and the power of the water was immense.
There's another one. That is unbelievable.
See if he can take his air out.
Oh, lucky.
He's calm.
Just. The rest of them are gone.
What David Judson was witnessing was the deadly phenomenon known as a flash flood.
Flash flood's normally defined as something that happens very quickly, with rainfall sort of between 2 and 6 hours, having a significant overland flooding.
Flood hydrologist Mark Babbister has forensically studied why and how mutant floods like these happen. He's made it his life's work.
And what makes them so dangerous is you get so little warning. And the warning is so short that even the Bureau of Meteorology's ability to forecast those floods is quite challenging. They can tell you there's a risk of it, but they can't really say in 2 hours we expect something to happen.
So we're no longer looking at sort of river systems slowly moving through. We're looking at the water just piling up in these areas, especially in the mountain ranges. It can be quite devastating. It's a very intense event, and unfortunately, it's very hard to predict.
So what happened in Toowoomba was a typical example of a flash flood. We had a very short, intense burst of rainfall, and what was just a normal creek very quickly filled, entered what we call the floodplain, which is where car parks were and shops were, and that rose really quickly, long before people could get their cars out. It rose in less than 5 minutes. It broke the banks, and then cars were being swept away. We spent a lot of time researching how climate change will affect extreme rainfall and flooding, and nearly all of the predictions are coming true. We're starting to see these statistically significant trends in short-duration rainfall. And that's really going to lead to a significant increase in flooding.
And as the water continued to rise, David Jutson's mobile phone captured the force of its destruction.
In the time that I was filming, the water rose in this area here that you see right now. It's dry. And yeah, it rose above this bridge and even further. The power of it was, the force that came through here was incredible.
Oh, that is horrible.
The sound of the rain was deafening. It's a tin roof on that building. And so in there, you couldn't hear anything but the rain. And the sound of water itself is, when it's moving in power, is terrifying.
Oh, goodness.
The raging torrent in the streets of Toowoomba was now rushing down the mountain toward Grandam. The small town, with a population of just a few hundred, was right in its path. And by afternoon, the flood was in town.
At 4 o'clock on Monday the 10th, we had a tsunami come through town, which was unheard of, unseen before. It went from nothing in the main street to 4 or 5 foot deep within a minute, which was basically put at about just above knee height inside my service station. And then once it got to waist height, I knew then I was in trouble. And then I tried to take my escape route and noted that I wasn't getting out through there. I ended up going back inside my service station, and this happened within probably 3 minutes.
Then a surge of floodwater hit Marty's service station.
It was that muddy and dirty, it just blackened any daylight out of the shop. All the windows smashed in, and all the products and fridges and freezers inside the service station all got smashed into the back wall, and I was basically treading water inside my shop, and that was basically the first time I tasted the feeling of, I'm going to meet my maker today. I'm not getting out of this.
By now, the water had risen so quickly, Marty was about to drown inside his service station.
I knew I basically had probably 5 or 6 inches of air between the water level and the ceiling inside my shop. I could feel my hat hitting the ceiling inside, and knew if I stayed inside the shop, I wasn't going to make it. And I knew that if I got out through the door, that the current was going that fast past the service station entrance that I probably wasn't going to survive outside either.
Marty knew he would need to act if he was going to survive.
I took a deep breath, duck dived under the water to the door and swam out through the door, and as I was going out through the door, the current was that swift that it spun me sideways. I remember my hip hitting the door jamb and felt like I was just being swept away. I was lucky enough to be able to grab hold of the awning that's off the front of my building, managed to climb along the awning and then drag myself up onto the roof. I remember when I grabbed hold of the awning, the water was flowing that fast that it was basically like I was being towed behind a boat. It lifted me horizontally in the water. What unfolded then visually was just incomprehensible. The amount of water, the force of the water, and the amount of debris that was in that water was just, unless you've seen it, you wouldn't believe it. Like, every single thing that is in someone's house, under someone's house, shipping containers, cars, boats still on trailers, things that you think could not possibly be pushed by water. Once I got up on the roof, surprisingly, there was already helicopters in the sky. And I was thinking to myself, wow, how did they respond so quickly? You know, because from the time of being nothing to me being on the roof was like 15 minutes. How can the helicopters be here so quickly? Unbeknown at the time, Toowoomba had gone through an unprecedented event in the streets there.
In Toowoomba, the creek that David Judson was recording on his phone now resembled a raging river.
Oh, got it?
Yeah. Oh. Oh my goodness.
It was unfathomable. Like you'd never seen something like this before. It certainly was a disaster zone. It almost had that earthquake feel where the power of the water that moved and pushed these cars into angles and directions that shouldn't be possible. In the space of, 5-10 minutes, the water rose to something that it just kept on rising.
That is unbelievable.
The power of the water was immense.
Oh my goodness.
Cars all along behind us. People who didn't get there in time, their cars were just washed away.
First excited, David was now terrified.
I was scared for myself. I remember calling my family.
Back in Grantham, Marty's situation had taken a turn for the worse. He captured the drama as it unfolded. And as the water levels rose, his thoughts turned to his loved ones.
That's when I thought, hell, I better try and contact my wife and my son and my parents, and because I've been through so many floods previously, I'd learned to put my mobile phone in a clip-lock sealed airtight bag. I then rang my wife and my son, firstly to tell them that I was safe on the roof. But it ended up being if I don't get through this, tell them that I love them. And I'm sorry for putting myself in this situation. I basically told them that I loved them and said goodbye.
Ex-military operative and risk management expert Joanna Harmdorf has worked in extreme and dangerous environments around the world. She has seen the devastation of floods firsthand, and she knows exactly what you should do if you are trapped in a flood.
Personally, I've been involved in a flood, and sadly the recovery parts of a flood as well afterwards when I was in the army. And after seeing that and see what Mother Nature can do, I have a different kind of respect for her. I wouldn't call it a fear, but the damage that she can do if she wants to is unbelievable. If you do end up on your roof and you get impatient or you're running out of food and water and you think it's tempting to actually jump into the water and think you can swim somewhere else, don't. It's extremely dangerous. You do not know what's running in the water, what's flowing through it, cars, trees. There's a lot of stuff in there that can actually hurt you. Would you end up in the water though? You're best off to lie flat on your back, cover your head with your hands to make sure that anything that is flowing through the water doesn't hit you in the head and knocks you out. And you can also see where you're going. So if you see anything like a pole, or tree, or a house that hasn't been moved yet, then try to hold on to that.
The rain did not relent. The waters engulfing Toowoomba and Grandam were making their way toward the city of Brisbane.
So in the Queensland floods, down the river, we had in the order of 10,000 cubic metres per second. And people, what does 10,000 cubic metres per second mean? You have 10,000 1 metre by 1 metre boxes of water that each weigh a tonne going past every second. And that's why floodwater is so destructive.
The floodwaters were feeding straight into the Brisbane River, which snakes its way through Australia's third most populated city. On that river is the Wivenhoe Dam, now overflowing, and a new chapter in this mutant weather event was about to begin.
And it would happen right in the heart of a city with more than 2 million people.
It was a perfect storm, or if you're certainly operating a dam, it was your worst nightmare.
The dam was opened, unleashing a torrent of water that flooded the busy metropolitan streets of Brisbane. Chaos reigned.
The flood now impacted most of Queensland,
a state 2.5 times the size of Texas. The 2011 flood was supposed to be a 1-in-100-year event. But 2 years later, in January 2013, Mother Nature unleashed another freak flood. And once again, the community was taken by surprise.
It was certainly unexpected.
And it came out of the blue for Matthew Brandon, who was working for the Royal Capricorn Helicopter Rescue Service in Rockhampton on the central Queensland coast. Matthew was an air crewman at the time, responsible for hoisting people stranded in floodwaters to safety.
I suppose just seeing the floods and seeing the effect of them, especially from the air where you get that big picture perspective, it was extraordinary. It certainly put a lot of things into perspective. You know, it could have been 5 feet deep, it could have been 50 feet deep. This massive water sort of flowing through, and you had plenty of debris, plenty of trees, dead livestock, people's houses that had just, was just flowing through. It was just, basically anything the water could get a hold of, it was just washing away.
Over the worst days of the flood, the rescue calls would come in. Matthew and his team were the first responders on the scene. This is what a day in the office looks like for an air crewman, where every rescue could be your last.
This lady here is saying that the man and woman in the boat went to their assistance. Yeah. Okay. Then they lost sight of them and the boat went away. It didn't know. Further downriver. Further downriver.
There was definitely a couple of metres between life and death of not only the person that you're trying to save or the rescue crewman when we lowered him down, but if the hoist cable had contacted the wires, then you're starting to look at possible catastrophic damage that could have resulted in a crash. Helicopters, when they're conducting these rescues, are at their most vulnerable. Helicopters are quite capable aircraft, but when they're in the hover and stationary, that's when they're using the most amount of power to stay aloft. At times when you were flying through the rain, the visibility was reduced down to zero. We still had to fly with the door open, and we were basically nap of earth flying, so we were actually following the roadways at about 50 feet above the trees, just so that we could see where we were going. So it was extremely dangerous, flying. Fairly unforgiving environment, and it's, if something goes wrong, then the problems and the lives that are at risk are, greatly magnified, because all of a sudden you've got a downed helicopter. The most hazardous rescue we did was an elderly lady who was stuck in her car. As she's tried to exit the vehicle, she's opened the door, but then the weight of the floodwaters has actually pushed the door closed and had trapped her in the door of the car. Well, that was the most dangerous rescue, just because you've got these telegraph poles and the wires, not to mention the visibility, because it's still raining here, so you've got rain covering your visors, with the hoist cable coming down close to those wires. All it takes is something to be wrapped around them, and then you have to cut the cable or something gets tangled. And now you've got a second person down there whose life's at risk.
Matthew's flown in the Middle East on Black Hawk helicopters. He's used to operating in emergencies, but one rescue call during that flood will be etched in his mind forever.
My recollection of that day was that we got the call to say that there was a vehicle stuck in floodwaters with 2 women and a small child that were stuck in the back of the ute.
When the call came in over the radio, Matthew, Brandon and his team were caught off guard. They were told there was a baby trapped in the ute, and they realised they didn't have a harness for a small child. They grabbed what they thought could work, and armed with a winch and just a dive bag, they rushed to the site. Emergency services had already attempted to rescue the 2 women and the child, but the violent rapids of the flood were too dangerous for any watercraft.
They had actually attempted to get a swiftwater rescue boat out to the vehicle, but just because of the location and the water, they were unsuccessful. When we first arrived at the scene, you could see the vehicle. It was well and truly covered in floodwaters. At any moment in time, it could start washing downriver, or it could flip over, in which case you've got 3 people in rapidly moving water, definitely in fear of losing their lives. We've circled it, come into position and started lowering down to the vehicle.
As the rescue team came closer, they could see the fear in their eyes.
They were extremely distressed, yeah. They were, yeah, very, very, very scared.
Matthew's hand firmly gripped the only lifeline this child had.
So once we got there, started bringing the people up, the first person was the child. That was our main priority.
Let's go. You'll come with me first, Bob? Yep. The baby? Yeah, absolutely. Put her in the bag, darling. You go. Girl. You go. Put her on the thing. I'm on that lady. No. Here you go. You go, darling. Okay, get the bag up for me. Go, darling.
With the distressed child in the bag about to be lifted up to the chopper, the distraught mother needed reassurance.
Yep, stay down. Stay north to low. I'll be back. Okay, I'm coming back, all right? I will come back to your boat. It's all okay. Yes.
Basically, yeah, putting a 2.5-year-old into a dive bag. Got him up to the top. Him being handed off to the paramedic that was in the back of the aircraft, and then him unzipping the bag and the toddler's head, you know, coming out of the bag. That was what everybody reacted to, yeah.
But time was running out for the two women still trapped in the car.
The two ladies were, you know, very scared.
Okay, who's next? So come with me. Take your arms down. Back to you. Lay down. Come on, come on. Take your arms down. Make it all the way. Enjoy the ride. Say goodbye.
And honestly, I don't know how they did what they did for the initial rescue. That vehicle, you know, could have potentially just washed away at any moment. Yeah, they broke down as soon as they got into the aircraft, broke down into tears.
The chopper landed safely with its precious cargo, the toddler and the two women, unharmed. For more than 2 days, Matthew and his team continued to save stranded people from the floodwaters, risking their lives on this do-or-die mission.
They were all at risk of losing their lives. The last guy that we got up had to be dragged into the aircraft. He was absolutely exhausted, and it was a real struggle to get him into the aircraft because there was just no space to put him. Their temperament changed from that nervous, just absolute distress to relief, you know, almost as soon as they got into the aircraft, and they knew that they had been saved, that they weren't in danger anymore. You could see the relief wash over their face. You know, all up, it would probably be 20-odd rescues.
Weighed down with survivors of the flood, the aircraft was at maximum capacity and it was losing power fast. Matthew and his team had to make the decision to return to base.
The frustration that, you wanted to do more than you could, but just because of the weather, sometimes we couldn't get there.
Despite Matthew's frustration, the people he saved over those 2 harrowing days call him a hero. For Marty Warburton, stranded in the monster floods of 2011, rescue wasn't an option. He'd now retreated to the roof of his Grantham service station. With all hope lost, Marty reached for his phone and said his final goodbyes to his wife and son. For Marty, the next few minutes felt like an eternity.
Being up on the roof, it was water for as far as you can see.
But moments later, something did appear on the muddy horizon, an intact house floating through the floodwaters.
While I was up on the roof, after getting myself together enough to start functioning again, I noticed off in the distance a house had popped off its stumps and come out through the trees and was starting to float through the farming paddocks. For some reason, I got my phone out and started videoing it as it was going past in the paddock, thinking to myself, is this real? Am I really? Is this really happening? And I think that's the reason why I got my camera out to record it, is because I wasn't believing what I was seeing.
And then a shocking realisation. There were people inside.
You're up on the roof there, and you can hear people screaming for help. You could hear them screaming for help, and the house floated off. And I remember the feeling of just being useless.
For Marty, this was like living a nightmare.
I thought I saw someone trying to swim. I leaned over the awning and tried to grab them and grabbed their arm and rolled them over, and that's when I realised they weren't trying to swim, that they were already gone. And it I didn't recognise the person in the water because they'd basically had no face left. I sort of kicked myself for letting go, but it shocked me that bad. I let go and fell back on the roof of the awning, and I still see that image, mainly at night.
Marty's nightmare continued through the day into the night.
I could see the emergency flashing lights about a kilometre away, and I just kept on convincing myself that, because I could see the lights, that rescuers were coming, and I just had to sit tight. But about 11:30, I think, 11:30, midnight, the lightning started. Storm came over and there was just lightning everywhere, and I was basically sitting on the biggest steel construction left standing in our town. And I was really starting to worry that I was going to get electrocuted from the lightning.
Marty was sure he wouldn't survive the night if he stayed on the roof.
I had to decide whether I stay up there or whether I try and swim to safety. I tried getting off the roof of the service station, and the gutter gave way and I fell into the water. And
Marty doesn't remember much about what happened next. But, as if carried by angels, the floodwaters took Marty to higher ground.
I could see lights at the outside the school, flashlights, because there was no power in town. And walking towards the lights and then hearing people saying, "Marty, you're alive. We thought you were gone." It was just that feeling of relief that you were safe. Many times I thought my young fella was going to grow up without his dad. And that was the thing that hurt me the most, was how was it going to affect him? Because for me, I'm dead, I'm gone. But just struggling to... And to know that so many in your community were dealing with that.
Many in Grantham never got the opportunity to see their loved ones again. Marty was one of the lucky few.
I remember just giving him a big hug and just not wanting to let go. Having a big cry. Just so thankful. Because by that time, you'd heard lost their lives in your community. By that time, the enormity of the event had sunk in. We lost 13 people that day out of 60 that were there. It was devastating. It wasn't big, it was a monster. Armageddon come to town and destroyed it. Unbelievable. And even still to this day, it's hard to comprehend that it got so big, that it was so big, that it was so violent, so destructive. Words cannot describe what Mother Nature unleashed on that day.
Marty's tried to move on from those 2 days of hell, but he can't help but think of the what-ifs. What if it happens again?
I fear for the next 2011. God, I hope it doesn't happen, but after experiencing that, anything can happen.
With the flood over in Toowoomba, David Judson was safe, but his town was destroyed.
I remember afterwards, once the water subsided below this bridge, walking across to the car park over here. It certainly was a disaster zone. The car park over here, like the water rose so much that it just stacked them like dominoes. It was horrifying.
In 2011, the first flood struck Toowoomba and Grantham. And in 2013, the second flood hit. In the space of 3 years, 2 monster floods ripped through Queensland. The state would never fully recover.
About 3/4 of the state was declared a disaster zone from that particular time period. So it was very intense rainfall over these heavily populated areas. We had massive suburbs inundated. The impacts were extensive, you know, major assets and infrastructure were inundated in a way that we didn't realise could happen.
When the floodwaters receded, the scale of the devastation was clear. More than 1 million people impacted and 12,000 seeking refuge in evacuation centres. And even more devastating, 35 lives taken.
The numbers are a bit scary. We had about 12,000 homes were inundated, and the estimates of damage vary a bit, but they're up about the $5 billion worth of damage done to infrastructure and assets.
We had something we hadn't really seen before. That the Queensland floods were probably the most devastating floods in Australia's history, with the number of people affected and the economic consequences to the country.
But scientists are telling us that with our changing unpredictable weather, extreme floods will become more common, and a bigger flood might be just around the corner.
What we are fairly confident about is under climate change, that unpredictability is what's going to increase. We'll get more unpredictable storms. Apply one of these future scenarios that we think might happen by 2050, what we estimate the damages will be will almost triple. People were unprepared for 2011. I think a lot of people expressed shock. They didn't realise that rain like that could fall, and they didn't know that rivers like that could be so high. 2011 was already bad, but if you're in that upper catchment, you could be almost 2 stories higher of flood levels in a future scenario.
Under a changing climate, we would expect to experience more extreme rainfall events. So this would mean heavier rain sometimes when it does rain. And particularly this means more flooding in urban areas, with stormwater flooding moving into drains, into creeks, causing flooding of homes, streets and infrastructure.
We're seeing an increased intensity and frequency of extreme events. They're here to stay and they're going to get worse.
In Southeast Australia, we're seeing much more volatile weather caused by climate change and other factors. That includes heavy rain events as well as droughts, and it also includes damaging rain events like hailstorms. Climate change affects tropical cyclones in a number of different ways. The ocean is like the heat engine for tropical cyclones. And with a warmer ocean, there's a lot more energy to fuel big storms. We'll have more intense storms. But the air is also warmer. And as the atmosphere warms up, it can hold more water vapor. That means that tropical cyclones now carry a lot more rain.
So climate change is having an effect on flooding. We do know as the world gets warmer that you can carry more moisture in the air. If you have more moisture in the air, you can have higher rainfall. We are now starting to see statistically significant increases in rainfall in short storms all around the country. And this is what was predicted from climate change. We'll certainly see more frequent, large floods, and the intensity of these large floods will increase. Our broad brush estimate for the country and the east coast of Australia, where most of Australians' flooding problem is, that what would occur once every 100 years by 2100 will occur about once every 60 years. We're going to see nearly a doubling in the frequency of those floods that cause devastation. We are struggling in Australia to deal with the current flood risk, and any increase from climate change will be really devastating. We should be planning for future climate risk.
David Jutsom isn't a scientist. He's a survivor. But after living through the Toowoomba floods, he thinks we need to recognise that our weather is changing.
When you see nature turn so quickly and so powerfully, it does humble you. You recognise how small and insignificant you are in that grand scheme of Mother Nature's power. After witnessing what we did in 2011 with that flood, it does make you fearful to a degree about how climate is changing.
Marty has seen the fury of mutant nature firsthand, and he says we can't ignore the signs Mother Nature is sending us.
I'm a strong believer that climate change is happening, global warming is happening, that weather patterns are changing, and you can't rape and pillage Mother Earth for 100 years and expect no retribution.